Hey everyone, Carlo here with AYCB, and today I'm going to show you how to play Cloudspire, which is a massive strategy game heavily influenced by the MOBA style of games, which is multiplayer online battle arena games, as well as tower defense games. In Cloudspire, each player takes on an asymmetric faction composed of heroes, minions, and spires. Players start on opposing ends of a large map with various different types of terrain, and the goal of the game is to either be the only person with a fortress left standing while the others have been destroyed, or to have the most powerful fortress at the end of the fourth wave when the game ends. Let me show you how to play. So I've gone ahead and set up for a standard head-to-head two-player game here. A bit later I'll go over the changes that happen when playing with 3 or more players. So as I mentioned, this game can be a maximum of 4 waves long. Each wave has 6 phases, and the bulk of the game takes place in the ONSLAUGHT phase, which is that final phase. You can think of the first 5 phases of each wave as kind of the setup and strategizing for that big ONSLAUGHT phase. So the first phase is the event phase. This is where an event card will be revealed, and an event will take place that will affect all players for that round. Next phase will be the income phase, where all players will gain source, which is the form of income in this game. Third phase will be the market phase, where players can start spending some of their source to buy things like mercenaries and Earthscape tiles, equipment for their heroes, things that can be used later on. The fourth phase is the build phase, where you can build and upgrade your spires, advance your fortress, or place Earthscapes that you acquired in the previous market phase. The fifth phase is the prep phase, where you basically choose which units you're going to send into battle that round, and you stack them up and get ready. That's pretty much it for those 5 setup phases, and then of course comes that big onslaught phase, which is where basically all the fighting takes place and the majority of the game is played. Players will take turns moving around the map, revealing landmark tiles, and fighting any units that they encounter on their way to the opponent's fortress. First, note that I've gone ahead and set up the battlefield already, but when you play, be sure to follow the setup rules in which you and your opponents will alternate placing these isles to create the battlefield. There's also some setup instructions for placing the landmarks. Also note that throughout the video I'll be referring to terrain types, which are these. The most common type are path hexes, which all units may move on. More on these later. For this 2-player tutorial, I'll be playing as the Brahmin faction, and I'll be against the Grove Tender faction. When players select their factions at the beginning of the game, they each get a stack of chips that represent all of their units, made up of 3 heroes and a variety of minions and spires. These will be placed in your barracks. Each player also gets a faction reference sheet which explains all the keywords and talents on their chips. Alright, so the hero and minion chips are fairly similar in terms of the iconography and stuff, but the spires are a little different, so I'm going to cover the spires a little later. Now let's get back to those 6 phases, starting with the event phase. So the first thing that happens in the event phase is the first player designation just passes clockwise. Then discard the event card from the previous wave, if there was one in play, and any relics that refer to events. Remove pegs from limited build slots on all fortresses, which we'll talk a bit more about later, and then reveal a new event card for this wave. There are no event cards revealed in the first wave of the game. Note, the event card will say exactly when this event takes place. If it simply says event phase, it takes effect as soon as the card is revealed. Second phase is income, where players gain source. The amount increases each round. You mark it on your source tracker in your fortress. You cannot go above 20 source unless you have a way of flipping your tracker over to the side that goes up to 30, usually with a fortress advancement. If you were playing with 3 or more players, this is also the point where any player with a defeated fortress would have to repair it. We'll talk a little more about that later. So the third phase is the market phase. Starting with the first player, each player may make a single purchase from the market, which includes Earthscapes, as well as market chips made up of mercenaries, spires, and equipment for your heroes. Earthscapes cost 2 source. The market chips list their source cost here in blue with the little gold circle. Be sure to track your spent source on your source tracker. After each market purchase, immediately refresh the option for the next player. However, only 1 Earthscape can be purchased each market phase. Keep your market purchases next to your barracks, as you can put them into play any wave, including the current one. The fourth phase is the build phase, and this is where you'll spend most of your source. So starting with the starting player, you'll go around and take turns taking one of 4 possible actions, or you can pass. Once you choose to pass, you're out for that build phase, and everyone else continues building until all players have passed. The 4 build options are construct a spire, upgrade a spire, advance your fortress, or place an Earthscape you acquired from the market. Let's look at each of these in a little more detail. To construct a spire, either pay the source cost to build a spire from your barracks, or place a spire you acquired from the market. Spires must be built on source wells unless otherwise stated, and you must have influence over the isle with the source well. You have influence over any isle that's either adjacent to your fortress gate, has one of your spires already, or is adjacent to an isle with one of your spires present. Note that multiple players can have influence over the same isles. If you construct a spire on an Earthscape, the isle underneath that hex is used for the influence check. More on constructing spires later. The second build option is to upgrade a spire. Pay the source cost to add as many of the following 3 upgrades, attack, range, and fortification, to one of your spires in play. Fortification upgrades on spires always cost 2 source, whereas if you're adding an attack or a range upgrade, the cost is equal to the current number of upgrades plus 1. So if there's 1 upgrade, then the second one you're adding costs 2, the third one costs 3, and so on. Upgrade chips are always placed on the bottom of the stack. Reminder, there's a limit on the number of upgrades a spire may have, which can be seen here. The third build option is to advance your fortress. Each faction has its own unique set of possible fortress advancements. These offer all kinds of interesting, game-changing abilities that really give these factions some identity. Each player's faction-specific sheet will indicate what all these advancements do and how much each one costs. After paying the source cost, place a peg in the appropriate spot to indicate the advancement. Advancements must always be purchased in ascending order starting with number 1. You can never skip a level 1 advancement to get to a number 2 or 3. The fourth and final build option is simply to place an Earthscape you acquired from the market. Just like Spires, placing an Earthscape requires an influence check. All Earthscapes have at least 1 source well on them, and when placing the Earthscape into play, you may immediately construct a spire on one of those source wells, pending the influence check, of course. You must still pay the cost of the spire when doing this. Next up is the prep phase. Normally players would start here by declaring their mark in turn order. Your mark is essentially which player's fortress all of your minions are going to be sort of programmed to march towards during that wave. Since we're doing a 2-player game, each player only has 1 opponent, so that opponent is your mark. We'll get more into this in the 3 and 4 player section later. All players simultaneously use their CP, command points, to select the units, heroes, and or minions from their barracks to deploy this wave. You're never required to use all of your CP, but any CP that you don't use gets lost. It cannot be carried over to a future wave. If you have any units beside your barracks, such as a merc you acquired from the market, you may deploy those at no CP cost. However, for any in-game effects, these mercs are considered to be in your barracks. You can select any number of minions for deployment each wave. You're only limited by the total CP cost and the units available in your barracks. For example, the Brahmin faction has 3 Battleborn units and 2 Dispatch units, but only 1 Source Siege. Minions can be prepared for deployment in 2 ways, grouped or ungrouped. You may group as many or as few minions as you'd like. Heroes can never be grouped. This is only an option for minions. Note that each faction has a starting hero with no CP cost, such as Osh for the Brahmin faction. Your starter hero is the only one that can be deployed in the first wave. From the second wave onwards, you can put in your other 2 heroes as well, along with any mercenary heroes you've purchased from the market, but the golden rule is just any player can never have more than 2 heroes in play at any time. Each player will make a deployment stack that looks something like this. 1 single stack with all the units they'll be deploying for this wave. When ready, place your deployment stack on your fortress gate hex. Note that heroes must be deployed either before or after all your other minions. So in other words, at the top or bottom of the stack. They cannot be deployed in between minions. However, you may deploy 1 hero before on the top and the other one afterwards on the bottom. Generally, players will simultaneously choose which units they're going to deploy for that round, as well as which order they go in their stack. But if you'd like, you can ask the player who goes before you in turn order to let you know which units they're deploying and in what order first before you lock in your choices. Once everyone is locked in their choices and everyone has their deployment stack ready to go on their fortress gate hex, the prep phase is over and the onslaught phase will begin. Before we get into the onslaught phase in detail though, I just need to go back and talk about the grouped minions that I mentioned before. When deploying minions as a group, only place the number of health chips below them, matching the topmost unit in the group. All grouped units below that one are considered inactive, may not be targeted in any way, and must remain grouped until the topmost unit is defeated. All grouped units will act as a single unit using the stats and talents of the topmost unit. Note, when grouping minions, they must be grouped in order of their movement stat from lowest to highest, top to bottom. If 2 minions have the same movement stat, you may choose which to place on top of the group. When the topmost minion is defeated, the next minion in the group becomes the active unit, and you'll immediately place the matching number of health chips underneath it. Extra damage dealt to that topmost minion does not carry over to the newly revealed minion that was underneath, and also once that new minion is revealed, it continues its turn at the same spot where the previous minion ended it. More on this later. So finally, we're at the Onslaught phase. As I said, this is where the bulk of the game takes place, so I'm going to go over it in very brief detail at first, then I'm going to have to go over some game concepts before we come back to it in more detail. So the main thing to keep in mind first is that each round of the Onslaught phase, players will take turns doing all of these actions, and then once their turn is done, it'll move to the next player in order, then that player will take all those actions, and so on and so forth until the wave ends. First, you'll resolve any talents, events, or relic cards that kick in at the start of your turn. Then you'll do all the movement of your units, moving them around the map. Then, if you're in range of any opposing spires, those spires will fire at your units. Then your units have the option to explore landmarks that are hidden. And finally, you'll end by doing all of your attacks. Again, once you've done all these, the next player will go, and you'll keep going around this way. The Onslaught phase only ends once all faction minions have been defeated. So keep in mind that doesn't include heroes. Any heroes that are left on the map once all the minions are gone, those heroes will stay out until the next wave and do not need to be deployed from your fortress hex gate again. Once you reach the end of the wave, you'll either start the next wave by reading the new event card, or if this is the end of the fourth wave, this is where you'll determine the winner. Now let's go over some of these game concepts, starting with the spires. As I hinted at earlier, spire chips with these silver borders work differently than hero and minion chips. So on spire chips, the red stat here is its attack stat, the green is range, and the yellow is fortification. This here shows its total upgrade capacity. Each faction has 4 different types of spires, and often certain ones can only be constructed once a particular fortress advancement has been unlocked, as noted on each faction reference sheet. When you construct a spire, add the matching upgrades underneath the spire in any order you choose, but they cannot be rearranged later. In a 2-player game, each player can have a maximum of 6 spires in play at one time. In a 3-player game, it's 5 max, and in a 4-player game, it's 4 max. The upgrade chips on the spires represent not only their stats, but also their health. Always be sure to refer only to the upgrades that are actually underneath the spire, rather than the ones noted on the left side of the spire. Those things on the left of the spire only represent what goes on there when it's constructed. As spires take damage and lose upgrades, you may choose different upgrades rather than replacing the same ones, as long as you don't go above the spire's upgrade capacity. If a spire begins with more upgrades than its capacity, such as this one, you may not upgrade the spire until it falls below its capacity. When adding upgrades to spires, they're always added to the bottom of the stack, and when spires are attacked, they also lose chips only from the bottom of the stack. Now let's talk about spire range. By default, all spires have a base range of 1, meaning they can attack units in adjacent hexes, regardless of terrain type. For each green range upgrade chip underneath a spire, add +1 to its range. By default, spires have a base attack value of 0. They only attack if they actually have attack chips underneath them, and the amount of attack chips underneath them determines how many of these white spire attack dice they'll roll. If they don't have any of those attack upgrade chips below them, they cannot attack, but they will stay in play until all the other upgrades are removed and they've been destroyed. Each spire only fires once per turn, so if you roll more than 1 die, roll them all first, add up the damage, and apply that amount to a single target in one shot. Note that the spire attack dice are 6-sided, with 4 regular hits, 1 damage, 1 critical hit for 2 damage, and 1 blank, which is a miss. When attacking a spire with one of your units, regardless of how powerful the attack is, you'll only remove 1 upgrade from the bottom of the spire from that single attack. In order to remove a fortification upgrade from the bottom of the spire, your attack needs to deal at least 2 damage. Fortifications that aren't on the bottom do not affect this in any way. Note that there are 2 spots on each player's fortress, one on either side of the fortress gate hex, where players can build spires. Since these are in your fortress, you always have influence here and are never restricted in building a spire. Remember that spires only ever fire at the active player, so your own spires will never fire on your turn. You'll only be fired at by other players' spires after you've moved. So that covers everything about spires. Now let's talk about how your minions and your heroes actually move around. So first off, heroes don't really have a whole lot of restrictions. As long as they obey the terrain allowance symbol on their chip, they can choose to use some, all, or none of their movement when they move. Minions, on the other hand, have quite a few restrictions and limitations. Let's talk about those now. The basic idea is that whenever possible, your minions must use their full movement stat while making progress towards their mark. If a minion cannot use its full movement to make progress, it will make progress using as much of its movement as possible. If it cannot make progress at all, it may make a lateral move, ending its movement no closer or further away from its mark. A minion can never end its movement further away from its mark than it started. While the minion's movement must end closer to its mark, it's not necessary to make the most efficient progress possible. However, minions cannot move back onto a hex they were previously on earlier in the same turn. Movement always begins with your leading minion, in other words, whichever one is closest to its mark. If more than one are tied, you may choose which minion to move first. Most minions don't have a terrain allowance icon, meaning most minions can only move on path terrain. Units, including heroes, can never move on to an occupied terrain hex, whether it contains another unit, a landmark, a spire, or any other chip. Enemy units and friendly minions may block the progress of your minions. Minions will always make as much progress as possible until they're blocked. Minions cannot be displaced to make room for others. But if one of your minions approaches a hex with your own hero and still has movement left, it will actually displace your hero and swap hexes with it. Your hero might even be displaced multiple times in a turn if it's blocking multiple minions. If a unit can take an alternate route, even if it's a longer route, it's not considered to be blocked. Let's talk about heroes returning to your fortress. So while your minions must always march towards their mark until they're defeated, a hero may return to their own fortress by moving back onto the fortress gate hex. If they do, they immediately recover to full health and are placed beside your barracks. Once a hero returns to the fortress to heal up, it cannot be deployed again in the same wave, but it can be deployed in subsequent waves at no additional CP cost. The other thing to remember is that if it had any upgrade chips attached to it or equipment, those stay on the hero even when it goes back to heal. Those will only ever be detached from the hero once the hero is defeated and completely leaves the game. Now let's talk about attacking. So like Spires, all units have an attack range of 1, meaning they can attack units only in adjacent hexes regardless of terrain type. Valid targets include opposing units like landmark minions, opposing spires, and opposing fortress gates as long as these are within range. Players can choose the order in which their units attack as well as which targets they attack. For your heroes, they don't even necessarily need to attack. Just like movement, you can forego the attack and not hit anyone. Minions, on the other hand, if they have a valid target, must attack, but again, the target is up to you as long as that target is within range. Note that if a player attacks another player's fortress gate, the only way to prevent that damage is if the attacked player still has units on their deployment stack at their fortress gate hex. If this is the case, the defending player may choose to redirect the damage to the unit at the top of the stack. Otherwise, the fortress will be attacked. So now let's get back to Retaliate. Whenever a unit attacks another unit, after dealing its damage, if the attacked unit survives, it will retaliate and deal damage based on its attack stat back to the attacker. It's important to note that spires will never retaliate, and players will never retaliate against spires. Fortresses, on the other hand, always retaliate for exactly 1 damage, and they have unlimited range. Opposing units can only retaliate once per turn, and any talents or keywords do not apply to retaliation. So, for example, if a unit has a talent like Flying or Armored, which normally limits who can attack them or the amount of damage dealt, Retaliate simply ignores those talents and still does damage equal to the attacked unit's attack stat. If the topmost minion in a grouped stack is defeated, the new minion below that becomes active does not retaliate on the defeated minion's behalf. Speaking of defeat, defeated minions are returned to your barracks and can be used again in future waves. Defeated heroes, however, are removed from the game entirely and cannot be deployed again, so you'll need to be extra careful with them. Also note that any defeated units that provide a reward bonus, such as Source, drawing relic cards, or building spires, will only provide that reward to the player who initiated the final blow on the defeated unit. If the reward is Source, mark it on your Source tracker immediately. If the reward has this relic symbol, draw that number of relic cards. If the reward has this Spire symbol, you may immediately build a Spire on this Source well at no cost while ignoring influence restrictions. This cannot exceed your normal Spire limit. Note, these Spire build rewards will only appear on landmark chips. If a hero defeats a unit, a Spire, or a fortress gate, it may immediately level up, which can happen in one of 2 ways. Either by being promoted, which involves flipping the chip over to its promoted side with the star, or by receiving upgrade chips. Each faction's minions have their own way of being promoted, which will be noted on your faction's reference sheet. most minions cannot receive upgrades. When a hero levels up after defeating a unit, spire, or fortress gate, check that hero's upgrade capacity. If it's not yet full, add any upgrade of your choice. If the upgrade capacity is full, instead flip the hero over to its promoted side and remove any upgrades beneath it. If the promoted side has more health, add the difference in health chips to the bottom, regardless of its current health. Note that you'll use the same upgrade chips as the ones you use for spires, but they don't work exactly the same. Attack upgrades increase your unit's attack stat by 1, and fortification upgrades count as an extra health. If your hero has a fortification chip, it will always lose that chip first when being attacked before losing any of the regular health chips. A range upgrade can only be added to units who already have the range talent, and those, like the attack upgrades, remain with the unit until it's either promoted or defeated. Upgrade chips on heroes go directly beneath the unit chip itself, not the bottom of the stack. If all opposing units, so that's all enemy minions and heroes, are defeated, and you as the only player left have heroes and minions in play, your heroes go into Campfire Mode for the rest of the wave, which means they are inactive, cannot take turns, or be interacted with in any way. Your minions continue to act as normal until being defeated. Now let's talk about landmarks. They always start face down on the map, and players can choose to reveal them during the exploration part of the Onslaught phase, or put them back face down after looking at them. Landmarks can be minions with a bronze border, or locations with no border. If you reveal a landmark with a health symbol, immediately add that number of health chips below it. When a landmark is defeated, it's removed from play. Now equipment. These ones have blue borders, and keep in mind they can only ever be purchased during the market phase. They only get attached to your heroes, which is done during the deployment phase. Each hero can only hold a maximum of 1 equipment. When that hero goes back to the fortress to heal, the equipment always stays on it and is only ever removed when that hero is defeated. And finally, Earthscape Placement. So when placing an Earthscape acquired from the market, there's a few rules to observe. First off, they may be placed either on top of an existing hex group or adjacent to one by extending the play area. They must always be placed on an even plane, so it can't be partially on the table and partially on an existing hex. In other words, the Earthscape must be flat. Earthscapes may be placed on path terrain, but there must always be path terrain connecting all fortresses. So you can cover up a path hex, like this, as long as it doesn't completely block off the path. Earthscapes cannot be placed on occupied hexes, but you may cover empty source wells. Now with all that covered, we can go back to the Onslaught phase. I'm going to show you what the first turn of an Onslaught phase might look like, starting from that deployment setup. Once you've resolved any start of turn triggers, you'll have the option to do limited build. Twice in every Onslaught wave, you can do this limited build action, which allows you to either construct or upgrade a spire. Limited builds cannot be used for your fortress advancements and Earthscape placements, which are actually reserved just for that build phase. If you take a limited build option, you place one of those blue pegs in your fortress advancement spot at the bottom. There are 2 spots to denote the limited builds you have per wave. These will get removed at the start of the next event phase. Now let's look at movement. So for example, your movement could look something like this. Remember, minions must move as much as possible towards their mark, while movement for heroes is optional, aside from the fact that heroes have to move off the fortress gate hex if they can. After movement, if any of your units are within range of enemy spires, those spires will fire. If more than one opponent has spires within range that can fire here, resolve those in turn order. Keep in mind that each spire can only fire once per turn. Now let's look at exploration. At this point, you can use any of your units, heroes or minions, to secretly peek at the face down side of any landmarks to which they are adjacent. You may explore as many landmarks as you'd like in this way. Now on to the attacks. So in this case, none of my units here have range, so only this Battleborn minion at the front would have a valid target. It would attack this unit for 1 damage, and as a result, it would take 1 retaliation damage in return. The next player would then take their turn going through those same steps in the Onslaught phase, and you'd go around the table doing that in turn order until the Onslaught phase ends, which is when there are no minions left in play. Now, the only way to win Cloudspire before the end of the 4th wave is to be the only player whose fortress is still standing. If everyone else's fortresses have been defeated, you immediately win. If the game goes to the end of the 4th wave, we have to resolve the victory by determining whose fortress is strongest. This is done with 2 factors. First, you look at the current health of your fortress gate, which starts at 10, and add 1 additional strength for each fortress advancement you've built, denoted by these pegs. Add those 2 numbers together, and that's your fortress strength. And the player with the strongest fortress wins. If there's a tie, the tiebreakers are as follows. First, it's the player whose actual fortress gate health is the highest, ignoring the advancement pegs. The second is the player with the most remaining source. The third is the player with the most spires in play. And if somehow it's still tied after all that, unfortunately players have to share the victory. And that's all you really need to know about the 2-player head-to-head game. Now let's talk about some of the minor changes for 3 or 4 players. So the first and most important one is that during the prep phase, you do have to select a mark. So if you have multiple opponents, you have to choose which opponent's fortress all of your minions are going to be automatically marching towards for that wave. You cannot change your mark once you've decided, and it'll only ever redirect to another player if your mark's fortress has been defeated, at which point as soon as that fortress is destroyed, your minions will then reshift to another player. When you defeat a fortress, you pillage that player's fortress. So you gain all of their remaining source while they set their tracker to 0. Once a fortress has been defeated, it can no longer become a player's mark for the rest of the wave. However, you can still deploy units from that fortress, and any units you already have in play can still attack. During the income phase of the game, if any player's fortress was previously defeated in the previous wave, at that point that player must repair their fortress. To do this, you must restore it to exactly 3 health by removing fortress advancements. 1 advancement per health gained. You must always sacrifice the highest level advancements first, so starting with your 3s and 2s before your 1s. If all of your advancements have been removed and your fortress is still below 3 health, then you must spend source at the cost of 2 source per health until your fortress is back up to 3. You cannot repair it past 3 health. And that's how you play Cloudspire. Now yes, there is a solo campaign mode, there's a solo endless mode, there's a 2-player cooperative campaign mode, there's a 4-player 2v2 team mode. There's all kinds of stuff out there to explore, so if you're interested in any of those, be sure to read the rule books or the appropriate campaign book scenarios. They're mostly the same game with a couple of alterations in how you set things up and so on, and how the AI interacts, but for the most part, if you've watched this, you basically are ready to get started with Cloudspire. So I hope you enjoy it. There are still some things to learn in terms of figuring out what all the talent keywords do and the intricacies of all the fortress advancements, but otherwise, yeah, you're basically ready to get started. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like what you saw, please like the video below, consider subscribing to our channel. Welcome to also check out our website at www.allyoucanboard.com. Otherwise, again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.